Hello, and welcome to episode 415 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrodin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many others. How are you this August 27th? We're doing back-to-back, Bill. One yesterday, one today. How are you?
Yeah, well, I'm a bit smoked there, Seth. I'm doing a talk on my experience in 9/11 at the Pentagon tonight as we record this. What? Yeah, you said it, August 27th. See how smoked I am? I didn't even hear you say the date. And I didn't sleep well last night. So, but this is a good topic and it's really important. We gotta hit this one out of the park.
Indeed, indeed. And if you're watching, you can see clearly that we have another guest on our third member of our crew today, our returning guest. He is the former Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, author of Black Snow, which is what we're going to talk about today, and Rampage, as well as many others, the latter of which was named one of the best books of 2018 by the editors of Amazon, Kirkus, and Military Times. His other works include Target Tokyo, a 2016 Pulitzer Prize finalist, The War Below, and The Attack on the Liberty, which won the Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison Award. Scholar in residence at the Citadel. Please welcome James Scott. James, good to have you back, my friend.
Guys, great to be back with y'all. Thanks for having me on.
Yep, we got an important topic to talk about, as Bill said. So let's get to it because there's a lot to riff on here. Strategic bombing. By definition, strategic bombing is an aerial offensive designed to destroy a country's ability and desire to wage war by demoralizing civilians and targeting an enemy's infrastructure. The key word is in the middle of that definition, demoralize. The basic thought behind bombing was that by destroying a country's factories, railroad yards, manufacturing ability, and the like would slow down their war effort and bring victory one step closer. Demoralization of the civilian populace was often seen as collateral damage, especially by the United States, or at least that's what we said. A good if it happens and we don't do it unless we have to, sort of thing. During World War II, nearly every country engaged in some sort of strategic bombing. In the late 1930s, Japan bombed the Chinese city of Chongqing for a period of over 2 years, inflicting tens of thousands of casualties. German bombing of English cities came after, with particular attention paid to the capital of London. Responding in kind, the British Royal Air Force began a punishing series of raids initially aimed at German industry, and then throwing everything out of the window, began a systematic destruction of the German population by nighttime fire raids on German cities, with the citizenry being the main targets. American Army Air Forces leaders vowed that their method of executing an aerial offensive would be targeted. By that, carefully chosen targets of vital importance to the German and later Japanese war machines would be obliterated with pinpoint accuracy. Civilians would not be the target. Their livelihoods and jobs would be. For the Army Air Forces in Europe, however, that was not always the case. In the Pacific, the leader of the new aerial offensive truly believed in the new weapon in his hands, the tactics of the time, and held firm to the moral belief that civilians shall not be targeted indiscriminately. Through trial and error, mostly error, as we shall see, however, these pre-war tactics and beliefs were put in the incinerator by a man whom many see as a villain and hero alike. Today, we're going to dig into both of these guys, as well as the tactics, beliefs, and practice of the strategic bombing campaign over Japan. Guys, this has always been, ever since my earliest days at the World War II Museum, this has always been a ticklish topic. And I take ticklish to take out the direct words of William F. Halsey, but it has been a ticklish topic because of the way we actually prosecuted this campaign over Japan. But it's incredibly important because once we get through this discussion, I think everybody will hopefully understand this definitely brought the war closer to an end. Would you guys not agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So we got to start when we're talking about strategic bombing, we got to start at the beginning, and we're not going to go way far back, but we're going to start to give people some sort of groundwork on this. American air strategists held firm in the belief that aerial strategic bombing could and would win a war. Much like Europe's specific targets inside the Japanese home islands had been chosen in an effort to break down Japanese war-making power. That is to say, their ability to produce the weapons and material for their military. This theory was ingrained in every American Army Air Forces officer. The theory that air power alone could render an opponent impotent stemmed from one man. And Bill, this morning, we were texting back and forth briefly, and you even said that as late back as or I guess as recently, you should say, as the 90s, this man was still an influence in American strategic thinking.
Yeah, that's right, Seth. Now, ironically, and this man is an Italian. We're going to talk about an Italian here for a second. I was originally told that my great grandfather on my mother's side was killed by an errant British bomb in 1943 in the town of Castropignano in Molise in Italy. And as I visited the site, I became convinced it was actually an artillery assault, not a bomb. However, the guy you're referring to, Seth, is a guy by the name of Giulio Duohet. Duohet doesn't sound like an Italian name, does it? But that was his name, and he wasn't Italian. He wrote a book called The Command of the Air in 1921, if you can believe that. And this treatise stated emphatically that the invention of the airplane would in the future have the largest influence on wars by operating in the new third dimension. He actually called it that in Italian, of course, meaning that because they could fly over battlefields and ships and everything else, ground troops, they would relegate infantry and sea power to secondary roles, thus pushing air power first and foremost as the rulers of the battlefield. The blunt force, which would win all wars in the future. Now, the American leadership swallowed this strategic concept whole, bought into this, hook, line, and sinker, and really believed it. And the point you were referring to, Seth, is when I was on the Joint Staff in the early 90s, 91-ish, and I was directed to qualify as a Joint Specialty Officer, GSO. I took an Air Command and Staff College correspondence course and had to focus on Duohet and write a pretty extensive term paper on him. And this was still Air Force doctrine.
James,
Bill, I was going to say, if I could jump in there real quick, I would just say, Duohet is such a fascinating figure, but I do think it's important to note that his writing and the writings of sort of his American counterpart, Billy Mitchell, that are going to come a little bit after him, really grow out of the traumatic infantry experience of World War One. And in World War One, of course, you look at battles like the Battle of the Somme, where the casualties are just, 50, 60,000 in a matter of just an hour or so. In the trench warfare and the hellacious conditions, the mud, the rats, and everything else, air warfare seemed to be the panacea, the solution to that stalemated ground war, because it opened up the ability for armies to sort of leapfrog over those battlefields and really take the war straight to the heart of the enemy's industrial capability in their cities. And so I think, they really kind of go together, because you got to look at when he's writing that book. It's the early 1920s, and it's really coming after this just traumatic moment for so much of Europe, which is, we can't live through this nonsense again, these kind of traumatic battlefield conditions. And the plane, therefore, becomes the solution to that. And I really think it's kind of one of the most revolutionary additions to the battlefield, probably since gunpowder. And, because what it does is, as Duohet said, as you noted, it really changes the spheres in which you can fight. And, since then, we haven't seen anything probably along those lines until cyber warfare. If you really think of, the development of going after infrastructure and energy grids and things like that is probably the greatest change we've had since aviation. So I digress, but I do think that's good context for the Duohet.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up the whole point of the strategic bomber, though, James, because this is the central portion of your book on Black Snow, which is on my shelf behind me here. The strategic bomber, and there was a thing in the American Army Air Forces, it was called the bomber mafia, because these guys, I'm talking about Ira Aker, Henry Arnold, of course, Hap Arnold, Billy Mitchell, and their contemporaries in Great Britain specifically, but especially in the United States Army Air Forces, the strategic bomber was king. It ruled everything, and every single decision making that was made from the 20s, especially after Billy Mitchell did his thing, all the way until the 1940s. What's your opinion on that there?
No, absolutely right. And for folks who are just kind of tuning in, who aren't all that familiar with it, the bomber mafia is sort of that. It refers to the Air Corps Tactical School. which was down in Maxwell in Alabama. And it's where during that interwar period, you had a group of young airmen who really spent their time trying to figure out what is the highest and best use of this new weapon that we have. And by that, it's the airplane. And they very quickly, people sort of broke down along two lines. You were either a fighter pilot or a bomber pilot. And most realized that future of aviation was going to be in bombers. And so guys like Haywood Hansell, guys like Curtis LeMay, a lot of them started off in fighters and then ultimately gravitated over toward strategic bombing because they realized that that was going to be the future. And what they did is they were really trying to figure out how do we use this new addition to the battlefield in the best way forward. And so that's a lot of what you see in that interwar period is like, okay, the development of these ideas, which is, okay, we can go after an enemy, we can leapfrog beyond the battlefield, we can go after their industrial capability. And the idea behind it was that modern economies are a lot like a house of cards. And so if you go and you target the enemy's steel mills or their fuel refineries and your rail systems and overpasses, you can render their ability to or knock out their ability to move goods and things like that and arrest the development of the materials they need for war and therefore paralyze them. And so it's a lot like, kind of coming in and sort of just pulling that bottom card out and letting the whole thing collapse. And so the idea was that it was a faster, more painless solution to warfare than the long, mighty battle on the fields and the trenches. It's important to note too, and I'm just not to digress too much, but you see a lot of this, and it's not just in aviation, but you also see it in the submarine service during this time period, this use of the interwar period and trying to figure out, because again, it's a relatively newer technology. Of course, it has its origins that go back prior to the airplane, but you also see the same kind of concept going on, which is a group of innovative young naval officers trying to figure out, all right, what can we do with submarines? How's that going to affect the future of naval combat? Just like you have these airmen saying, okay, what can we do with planes and how is that going to affect combat as well? So I think that the interwar period is really very, very pivotal for these two groups of fighters. And of course, as we see with World War II, the submarine service and the air service become incredibly important for victory there. I mean, they really are sort of the two dominant pillars there. Naval aviation, of course, and strategic bombing, and of course, the submarine service. So,
I see Bill waving his hands in the background.
I know Bill.
Thank you for that handoff. Thank you for that handoff. It gives me the opportunity to make several points. The first one is silly, but it's I love to say it, is dolphins are older than the gold aviator wings, right? The dolphin pins that we submariners wear was the first warfare insignia in the United States Navy. One of those Navy guys figuring out submarines is, of course, Lieutenant Nimitz, but that's not where I want to go with this. Let's spin off of this, Nimitz and introduction of the diesel engine into American submarines. So your point, and again, if I can riff off of you, Seth, you said through the 40s, the bomber mafia kind of dominated. No, I would make the point that was true through the nuclear weapons era in the 60s, right? And the beginning of the end, if I could be so bold, of this kind of pinnacle was, and this is going to sound silly, but I'm serious when I say it, was the movie Dr. Strangelove. For anyone who hasn't seen that movie, please watch it. This is the early 60s, and it kind of showed the kind of the ridiculousness. But the real end, I think, of the dominance of the bomber mafia was Operation Linebacker in Vietnam, where we tried to bomb the North Vietnamese into submission with B-52s, and it didn't work. And I think the tactical aviators in the Air Force said, the fighter mafia said, okay, I think we're going to take control of this service again and never to let go ever again. But now we got to have strategic bombing of the bomber mafia. Now we're going to do some tactical bombing by refocusing on World War II, I guess. Is that right, Seth?
Yeah, let's get back on the road here.
Yeah.
But the whole gist of what we were trying to say here is that this theory of the strategic bombing by striking into the enemy's heartland and destroying, as you said, exactly their infrastructure, their ability to make war, and the materials that materiel for war, such as aircraft or engines or whatever. This is what is based this whole cluster of officers in the American Army Air Forces, Army Air Corps at the time. This is what their entire careers were revolved around. And when you compare it to Europe, Japan is not really 100% similar, especially in 1944 and 1945, in terms of targeting. You could go to Germany and you could bomb, the Erkner ball bearing factory outside of Berlin, and you could put a hurt on German capabilities for a little while, but Japan was a little bit different in some way, shape, or form. There were factories in Japan for sure. Obviously, there were quite a few of them to be sure. The Musashino factory, which we're going to talk about a lot today, was an early target for Haywood Hansell. I mean, how many times did they try and hit that thing? A good dozen, at least. But by and large, most industrial targets inside Japan were intermixed within the city's population. And we're going to talk about this. This comes into play here later on. It was known as early as the late 1930s that bombing Japan to bring her to her knees would more than likely require the use of incendiaries. And James, we're going to talk about the whole process of how we got to this here in just a few minutes. Her city's made of paper and wood, which was a known thing. Japan was essentially a tinderbox waiting to be lit. Let's talk about the guy who started off with the B-29s and the Marianas. And we're not going to talk about the B-29s in China right now because that's a whole nother topic of discussion that we can have that we're not going to today. But this guy, James, he had an odd nickname. He was a Southern gentleman. His name was Haywood Possum Hansell. Who was Possum Hansell?
Yeah, so Haywood Hansell was he's a fascinating figure, and I'll tell you, he has this most unfortunate nickname. Although those of us from the South, I'm sure we've all known somebody named Possum, and as crafty as those marsupials can be, it is never a positive name. And Hansell always tried to argue that his nickname came from his great intellect and his conniving abilities and things like that. But his wife would later slip up and let it be known that actually his dreadful nickname came from his physical resemblance to a possum. And I'll tell you, if you ever look at that, there's a great photo of Hansell, and I've actually done it in presentations where I put it up next to this photo of a possum, and you can really do see the resemblance of where that youthful name came from and sort of how it stuck to him. So Hansell was a true believer. He'd started out, of course, in fighters. He was a really good pursuit pilot. He'd flown with Claire Chennault and done a lot of aerial acrobatics early in his career. In fact, during that early period of aviation, when America was building a lot of new airports and things like that, and I know it's hard for people to wrap their heads around that today because air transport is so common. I mean, I seem to live in airports. I'm flying out every other week. But of course, back in the 1920s, 1930s, of course, this was, opening a new airport was a big deal for a community. And so they would often bring in Army aviators and have them fly stunts. Of course, this is the barnstorming era. You got guys like Jimmy Doolittle out there doing it and things like that. And Hansell was really good at it. And so he was so good. In fact, he flew with Claire Chennault, who, of course, would later go on to be, Flying Tigers fame and whatnot. And of course, he then, like so many others from that generation, sort of begins to migrate over towards strategic bombing. He was he'd grown up the son of an Army officer. His father, in fact, he'd spent a lot of time traveling around. His family's roots were in the South. Hansell would, of course, later in life come back, settle in the South. In fact, he died right down the road from where I am here in Charleston. He was living on Hilton Head Island on Live Oak Drive there. And so but Hansell rose up, he came up through the bomber mafia, was a big believer in that. He was pretty tight with Hap Arnold, who was commander of the Army Air Forces. He'd served as Arnold's chief of staff. He had actually helped design the air war for Europe, which was using the same tactics to come out, the whole strategic bombing, high daylight, high altitude precision bombing, which was kind of what they called it at that time period of, again, going after the industry of another nation. He spent some time in Europe fighting. Of course, actually, he worked there with Curtis LeMay, who would ultimately, Kurt was his subordinate, later ultimately replaced him. The two of them were friendly, worked together. If you go through LeMay's personnel file, in fact, you'll find references Hansell wrote an accommodation letter for him. Hansell was the one who helped advocate for his promotion to brigadier general. But these two men were very different philosophically in a lot of ways. Hansell was, he was at his heart a Southern gentleman. I mean, he loved Shakespeare. He loved Gilbert and Sullivan operas. He was, for everybody who worked with him, really liked him. He was considered an excellent planner. He was an academic. He was a thinker. What he was not was an operator. And he was better suited for the classroom or for the planning bureau, but not for the guy out on the front lines leading a mission. He just didn't have the personality and it's just the character needed for that kind of war. But he ultimately, he comes out of the war in Germany. He's bypassed for promotion there. He's brought back. He helps plan the air war against Japan. And against the advice of some of his others on his staff, Hap Arnold ultimately picks him to be the guy to run the 21st Bomber Command. And of course, the 21st Bomber Command is going to be sort of the tip of the spear in the air war against Japan. It's going to operate in late 1944 initially out of Saipan. Of course, the United States is going to grab Saipan, Guam, and Tinian in the summer of 1944. They're going to develop those three islands into air bases to take the war directly to the heart of the Japanese homeland. Just 1,500 miles separates the Marianas from Japan. And of course, the development of the B-29, the single most expensive weapon system of the war. I mean, a phenomenal airplane in that time period. And it's going to be the combination of the Marianas and the B-29 are going to, for the first time, really put Tokyo and Japan's other key industrial cities into range of American might. Hansell's going to be the guy that's pioneering that. He literally goes out in the fall of 1944. The bases there are still being developed. There's still CBs working on Tinian. There's people living in tents and eating rations, and they're going to start bombing the Japanese homeland at that point. And he's going to be the guy leading it. And so he's going to face a ton of tremendous challenges. We can get into that in a minute. I'm sure I don't want to go too far down the road, depending on which direction you want to go in. But that is who Haywood Hansell is. He is this thinker, this kind-hearted guy who, and for a historian, he's a pack rat, and I love that. He kept everything he ever wrote. His papers, he's got a collection of papers at the Air Force Historical Research Center down in Maxwell. He's also got a collection of papers at the Air Force Academy. And so he's, if he wrote it down, he kept it. And as a historian, I'm eternally grateful to guys like that.
So one thing, go ahead, Bill.
No, I was going to say the reason you like Shakespeare is because Hamlet's nickname was also Possum. So, yeah. All right.
The thing with Hansell is that, and I want to bang on this because this has a huge effect on him keeping his job, or not so much actually, is that he abhorred the idea of indiscriminate bombing of civilians. This was something that was just appalling to him morally and emotionally as well. He couldn't bring himself to even thinking about doing that. And he was disgusted when he, saw what Bomber Harris was doing. And, places like Hamburg, 38,000, 40,000 people are killed in the fire raid in Hamburg. And, he was absolutely abhorred by that. What can you kind of put your fingers in there and tell us a little bit about that in regards to Hansell? What was his deal?
I think it really just kind of gets at who he was. I mean, he just was not, he was this kind-hearted individual, a big family guy. He was really against, he saw, and you have to remember when he's in Europe, of course, the Americans at that point are flying high altitude daylight strategic bombing. And as you noted, Bomber Harris is doing the city busting raids and things like that. And they're sort of flying these things. They're sort of tag teaming German cities and during this time period. And of course, Hansell is seeing the destruction. And after the raid on Hamburg, he and Curtis LeMay are actually looking over the photographs of it. And Hansell is very much appalled at that. And he says, America never needs to find itself in a situation where we're killing women and children. And LeMay, of course, who will ultimately replace him, has a very different view. He says, yes, you're seeing total destruction here, but amid these ruins is the industrial capacity of German, the war machine and its cities there. And so they do kind of come at it from different philosophies. But again, it gets at, that's just Hansell was a true believer in the concept of daylight high altitude precision bombing, and he did not want to see cities burned and civilians and killed in that, and that just kind of spoke to really who he was as a character, as an individual.
That's what I put in the notes. He was a dyed-in-the-wool member of that club. He definitely, without a doubt. Now, when he was in Europe, or even before, and he's planning the aerial strategic bombing campaign over Europe for the United States Army Air Forces, the 8th Air Force. He's basing all of his plans on the B-17 and the B-24. That is not the weapon that he was going to be using in the Pacific Theater. He's, of course, going to be using the Boeing B-29. And the B-29 Super Fortress, as you noted just briefly, that was easily the most expensive project, weapon system, whatever you want to say, of the Second World War for the United States. It was it was a ridiculously complex airplane for its time. Had a pressurized cabin, had remotely operated, gun turrets and all this fancy schmancy stuff. It was way far advanced for its time, but it was incredibly expensive. And on top of it, and this is where I want you to get in here, James, is that the head of the Army Air Forces, Hap Arnold, pretty much tied himself to this airplane from the get-go. And Arnold had a heavy hand in everything to do with the B-29, and he pretty much kind of staked his career on this airplane, did he not?
Yeah, he did actually. In fact, they called it his Arnold's gamble, so to speak. And he did. And Arnold was I love Hap Arnold, and I love writing about him. I've loved researching him. Hap Arnold is one of those transformative figures in aviation that people love to point to Duohet, they love to point to Billy Mitchell and people like that, and they kind of skip over Arnold in some ways. I mean, even though he's a big figure during World War II. But because largely he spends the war in Washington, he's dealing with stuff there. But people need to remember that Hap Arnold really came of age alongside aviation. He literally learned how to fly from Orville and Wilbur Wright in an Ohio cow pasture under the watchful eye of the local undertaker who didn't have a lot of faith in aviation. And so Arnold was like the Army's third registered pilot. Literally, he gets trusted to build the first Army flight school, and back in that time period, he in order to drum up interest in aviation, Arnold actually one time had to race carrier pigeons across the West Coast. He flew the mail. He did all sorts of things and really kind of came up. And he was an acolyte of Billy Mitchell, in fact. And so after Billy Mitchell gets sort of drummed out of the service, it kind of falls to Arnold and the other Mitchell acolytes to kind of continue that crusade. And Arnold learned a very valuable lesson from Billy Mitchell, which was you can try to tear down the system from the inside like that and get punished, or you can try to work within the system and get things done. And I think that's the biggest lesson that Arnold takes, and it's the wisest one. And as a result, he rises up to the point where he takes over as commander of the Army Air Forces and really is the one who helps grow the Air Force during World War II into becoming the largest global strike force in the world at its time. And of course, during that time period, he initiates a lot of different projects. And of course, one of the most significant ones is the B-29. And the B-29 grows out of his fear that as Hitler is gaining strength in Europe, and of course, the America's paying close attention to that. We're monitoring what's going on. Guys like Jimmy Doolittle are going over there. They're paying, they're sending back reports and things like that. He gets worried that England might fall. And if England might falls, the B-17 is not going to be the kind of plane that the United States can fall back on for being sort of a hemispheric bomber. And so he sets in motion the development of a new bomber, which is going to be the B-29, because and the B-29 is the super fortress. It's like its name implies, it's supersized. It's bigger, it carries more, it flies farther, it does everything he needs to do. And so Arnold rushes this thing into production before ever even knowing whether this sucker can fly. Mm-hmm. In fact, he's already ordered over 1,000 of them. I think about 1,600 of them or so. When one of the first test flights of the B-29, it crashes into a Seattle meatpacking factory, kills dozens of people, and is just a huge, massive setback. This bomber is so sophisticated for its era and so complex that it's a very difficult plane to put into production and to sort of see its way through. And so it is mired throughout the war with design, technical issues, things of that nature. So it's really a question of whether or not it's even going to be able to get into combat in time to have a difference in World War II. And it's only through Arnold's just constant writing of his subordinates and sort of really giving the B-29 top priority does it finally kind of literally roll out of the first aircraft manufacturing hangars in 1944 and literally head straight into combat. And of course, once you see the B-17, of course, has a lot of years of sort of to iron out the kinks and things like that before it goes into combat. The B-29 literally leaves, its manufacturing, goes straight into combat. And guess what? You're going to figure out that a plane that's that complex, okay, it has over 55,000 parts, 600,000 rivets. It's got a tail the size of a 3-story building, a wingspan longer than the Wright brothers' first flight. Guess what? Something that complex, it's going to have issues. I mean, and sure enough, it does. And so literally throughout its time in the war, they're going to be chasing these bugs throughout it. And of course, the challenge is that if you look at the missions that guys are flying in Europe, take off from around London, let's say, you got to fly to Berlin and back, it's 1,500 miles, right? Take a bunch of flak damage or you have an engine fire, you can bail out anywhere along that way, along that route. The worst case scenario, you're going to get captured by the Germans. Hopefully you're going to land in an occupied country. But in the end, you can bail out. The flight from the Marianas to Tokyo until we get Iwo Jima in the spring of 1945, all water, and then you get over, if you have an engine fire, what are you going to do? Where are you going to put down? You take a bunch of flak damage, fighter damage, same thing. And so literally and of course, each mission one way is 1,500 miles. So it's literally just to get to Tokyo is the equivalent of a round trip flight from England to Berlin and back. So these distances are extraordinary. You're flying over open water the entire time. Yes, they put submarines and destroyers out there, but literally about 1 out of every 4 crews that has to put down in the Pacific gets rescued. The rest we just don't ever hear from again. They're lost. And so these are long, dangerous missions in an airplane that is incredibly expensive, $3.7 billion to develop and build. It's cost of the atomic bomb. It's almost twice the cost of the atomic bomb. And of course, the flying conditions that these airmen are dealing with are tremendous. We eventually do get Iwo Jima. In fact, even as the battle for Iwo Jima is going on in February and March of 1945, B-29s are landing there because they're shot up or they need they've got engine problems. They're telling the air crews, don't get off the plane. If you get off the plane, you'll get shot. So, literally Iwo Jima ends up being a lifesaver for lots and lots of these airmen. Okinawa would later perform a similar function after we got Okinawa in the summer of 1945 as well. So, yeah, that's kind of the backstory of the B-29. Arnold was absolutely right in demanding it. It did allow the B-29 is the plane that allowed the U.S. to bridge that distance. Of course, it also was the only plane in which an atomic weapon would fit into. There had been talk about possibly using a Lancaster to take the atomic bombs, but Hap Arnold would never have an American-made weapon put in the back of a British bomber like that. So, yeah.
Not a chance. And that's the key is with the B-29 is that it was buggy, to say the least. I mean, it was notorious for its engine fires, whatever you want to say. I mean, it was horribly buggy for the time, but all the money that had been spent on it, Arnold tying his career to it, that sucker was going to see its action. And exactly to your point, it was the only weapon aircraft that we had at the time that could actually reach Tokyo or just Japan in general from the bases that we currently had. So speaking of which,
and you got to remember too, one thing I'll add is look how short the American air war against Japan really is.
Right.
I mean, if you look at how long the air war against Germany is, I mean, by the time we get in there in the war, I mean, Britain's already been flying for ages against the Germans or whatnot. Right. Then it goes all the way on through 44, 45. We literally don't start our air war. I mean, Jimmy Doolittle hits in April of 42. It's not until late 44 that an American bomber shows up in the skies over Tokyo.
Right.
And it goes from our first missions in November of 44, war's over in August 45. So, I mean, the American air war it's short, and it's tight, and it's highly destructive.
Oh, yeah, very much so. I mean, just in context, we flew our first missions at the 8th Air Force in August 17th, 1942. The Brits had been bombing Germany for over 2 years before we ever got over there. So, yeah, it was a hell of a long campaign in Europe and a really, really short one in the Pacific. But it was based on these weapons that we had. So upon arriving in theater in October 1944, we touched on this briefly, but we're going to get into it now. Hansell found that the main B-29 base that had been paid for dearly in American blood, Saipan, was nowhere near. And we're going to talk about all the problems that these guys had, LeMay included, in the build up to what eventually became a successful campaign. But Saipan was nowhere near ready for the reception of the B-29s that were going to come. Tinian was even further behind, and Guam was even further behind than those. There were no barracks, no machine shops, mess halls, or anything else that resembled any kind of a base at all. Aside from the fields, Hansell had other problems as well. The B-29 crews, James, and this is exactly to your point, were inexperienced. High altitude formation flying was almost non-existent in this aircraft, and most of the crews had less than 100 hours in type. Well, I guess you do if you're rolling them on the factory floor and you're flying them across the Pacific. The only hours in type you're going to have is that ferry mission from, wherever in Washington to Saipan, and all stops in between. Another issue for Hansell was the fact that, unlike Germany, and we can get into this in a minute too, target data for Japan was significantly lacking. That problem, or at least part of it, was resolved in November 44 when a recon B-29 flew over Tokyo, shooting over 7,000 plus images of the Tokyo area. Factories, industrial works, and shipping harbors became very, very clear. On top of all of these issues, the fact that Saipan was a shell of what it would be, Tinian, Guam, and all this other stuff, inexperienced crews, Hansell arrives in theater, James, under the thumb of Hap Arnold. He is under immense pressure from the get-go. Can you shed some light on this for us?
Yeah. So I said earlier, I love Hap Arnold, and I do. I love writing about him. He was a miserable guy to work for. And his nickname, he had this head full of white grandfatherly hair, and he has this beautiful smile. And so Hap was short for happy, because when you see the photos of him grinning, you're like, I mean, he looks like this just awesome granddad, right? But to work for him, he could be brutal. I mean, he was just a taskmaster. In fact, one of my favorite lines one of his subordinates said is that he would have fired his own mother if she couldn't produce results. So I think that summarizes more than anything the pressure that's on Hap Arnold. And of course, you got to remember, so when the B-29, he has staked everything on this. It's literally almost $4 billion of taxpayer money, which, today, by today's standards, would be, close to $40 billion. And so, as well as the prestige of his Air Force, he's desperately pushing for the establishment of an independent air service, which at that point, it's not going to be until 1947 that happens, but it's important for folks who may not, be more casual historians here to know, of course, to this point, it's part of the Army. And so, but he's desperate for it to become an independent air service. And for that to happen, he needs his air service to own a share of victory alongside the Army and the Navy. And he's really kind of staked it on the air war against Japan and the strategic bomber. The B-29 is it. And so he's a real tough guy. So he's got all his eggs in this basket in Japan at this point, because the air war in Europe, we talked about earlier, is really a slog. I mean, it goes on year after year after year. In fact, more airmen are going to be lost in the heavens over Europe than the Marine Corps is going to lose in the entire war. And in the end, the air war really isn't decisive. I mean, you still have the invasion of Normandy. You still have to go town by town, village by village, all the way to Berlin. And so Arnold's kind of, he's really then shifting his sights to Japan and saying that's where we can show that we can make a definitive difference and why we need to be an independent air service. And so he's put all this pressure on Hansell, and of course Hansell's worked for him. Hansell knows him. They're very familiar with each other. They're very friendly with each other. But Arnold's not going to cut him any slack whatsoever. And so when Hansell gets to Saipan, he realizes that, it's, just as you noted, the guys are literally living in tents. The airfield construction that they had hoped they were going to build all these air bases. The geography is such that it's not really going to happen. If you've ever been on Saipan, you kind of know you got Mount Tapachau right in the center, and then kind of all the slopes going off around it. And of course, the B-29 requires an 8,500 foot long runway. I mean, it's a monstrous plane, fully loaded, weighs 140,000 pounds. It takes a lot of space to get those suckers airborne. And of course, he doesn't have much space to be able to build them there. As a result of that, Guam and Tinian are going to be where a lot of the development goes. Tinian in particular is going to end up being the largest airport that the United States has in the war. Of course, it's almost completely flat. It's perfectly set out for it. But of course, when Hansell gets over there, it's just super, super primitive at that point. And you got to remember, you're bringing this highly sophisticated plane into an environment where guys are blowing up coral with dynamite. There's dust everywhere. It's getting into all of your equipment. You're literally storing your ordnance and everything outside. I mean, you're fighting the conditions. It's hot, it's muggy. And on top of all this, the Japanese still control Iwo Jima, and they're going to start raiding you at night. Blowing stuff up. I mean, Hansell's going to see about 60 of his bombers get either destroyed or damaged through these nighttime raids. I mean, so he really just kind of comes into a very difficult situation, a primitive base that he's got to see developed out, a brand new buggy airplane that's going to have all these sorts of issues, missions that are extraordinarily long and difficult, air crews that have virtually no experience. And of course, the Japanese are going to be attacking you at night. And your boss is a psychopath who's going to be breathing down your neck. That's basically Hap Arnold's, basically Haywood Hansell's world in October and November of 1944.
Yeah.
And
No pressure.
Exactly.
No pressure.
No pressure at all. So he arrives in October of 44, and he is under no false illusions that Arnold wants him to start the air war like yesterday.
Exactly.
You need this to start now. I don't give a rat's patoot if you have to fill these B-29s fuel tanks up with a handy billy, but you're going to get it going, and you're going to get it going now. Mm-hmm. To that end, Hansell plans his first mission for less than a month after he arrives in theater with the limited amount of facilities, supplies, people, airplanes, what have you. And the target is Tokyo. It's not like you're going to go on a milk run for your first target. You're not going to go hit, some little island somewhere or nothing. No, you going for the throat on the first shot. So the mission that Hansell plans, Bill, mission number one, tell us about that, about what is eventually called San Antonio 1.
Yeah. So Hansell. Sorry. No, you got that. Go for it. Yeah.
No, it's all right. Yeah, so it's going to raid Nakajima Aircraft Factory in Musashino. It's a suburb of Greater Tokyo. And this one is a large factory by Japanese standards. It's a 130-acre site occupying some 3 million square feet. So this is a big target, right? You should be able to hit this thing with the Norden bomb sight. And employing over 40,000 people. On average, the factory could produce some 1,200 aircraft engines a month. And the target producer, they were the largest producer of airframes and aircraft engines in Japan. So, should be an easy target, right, James?
Should be, but again, all those factors that we were talking about earlier all kind of come into play here. And one of the big struggles that Hansell does is he's insisting that his guys all fly in formation at high altitudes the whole way out. And that puts a tremendous amount of strain on the engines of his B-29s. And as they quickly discover, the engines are going to be the weak point of this great new airplane, and they're going to catch on fire. And so he has a whole lot of guys take off. They end up aborting the mission. They don't make it all the way there. They're timid. They miss. They do very little damage to the factory. It's really pretty much a total bust of a mission. And that's going to kind of come to define a lot of Hansell's early missions. And it's also important to add that, the reason he's going after the Musashino factory there and others, they're trying to establish air dominance. And so they want to knock out Japan's ability to build more planes and put more planes in the skies and whatnot. So that's going to be the focus of these early missions, is their aircraft industry. And, but of course, everything that they've kind of put into place, thinking that's going to help out, of course, never really comes to play, and the mission ends up being a total bust.
Which, you brought that point up that, he's trying to knock out Japan's ability to build fighters, which of course is what is going to be attacking mostly, his B-29s. And if you know anything about the air war over Europe, the 8th Air Force air war over Europe, what were the first set of targets once we started bombing Germany? Not France, Germany. German fighter manufacturing plants. It's the exact same thing. It's ironic because it's the same dude who planned the same war over Europe is doing the same thing over Japan here too. We got to talk about this dude, and he's got a name that people are going to recognize, but it's not the person you're thinking of, and it's Rosie O'Donnell. Rosie O'Donnell is completely different. Believe me, different person entirely. Rosie O'Donnell is a loud voice in Hansell's ear and LeMay's ear too later, but to a lesser extent. Once Hansell issues his orders and his plans for this Tokyo raid, O'Donnell is, shall we say, insubordinate is a kind way to put it. Tell us about Rosie O'Donnell, James.
Yeah, so O'Donnell is he's he runs the 73rd wing, which is the basically he's flying all the missions. It's his guys that are taking off from Saipan, his guys that are flying to Tokyo and doing the bombing and whatnot. And O'Donnell, of course, is he's a West Point guy. He was a veteran of the early fights in the Philippines and whatnot. He too was had the ear of Hap Arnold. Was kind of considered a rising star and all that. And unlike Hansell, he very much thought that what the British were doing in the city busting raids was the tactic that the U.S. should be taking in Japan, and that these high altitude daylight bombing raids were a waste of time. They weren't hitting anything, and that they should just start setting Japanese cities on fire. And he really, kind of pushes it to the point almost of insubordination, in that he's kind of going around Arnold and pushing on Arnold. And so these two guys end up just really just completely butting heads out there. But in a lot of ways, O'Donnell's kind of foreshadowing the direction that America's ultimately going to head in. And he's putting that pressure, because in the end, it's not just O'Donnell who's going to pressure Hansell in that direction. These pressures are going to come out of Washington as well, with the realization that the high altitude precision bombing aren't going to happen. But on the ground in Saipan, the two of them are just completely butting heads, and it's affecting morale. It's coming, in debriefings. They're going at each other. it's just, you look at the diaries of some of the airmen, and they're like, this is just, it's untenable what's happening between them. But it really, at the heart of it, it is a differing view over the philosophy of how to go after Japan. Do you burn their cities, or do you pinpoint their industry? And that's inherently the play that's going to, the undercurrent of everything in the air war against Japan is going to be over those two ideologies.
So to that end, the first raid over Tokyo, as you said, was a complete flop, and it was because of several things, not the least of which is something that we're going to get into multiple times, is the high winds and unpredictable weather over the island nation of Japan, specifically the jet stream. That's the big deal right there. And it's essentially throwing everything off target, and it's causing all kinds of mishaps and odd situations in the air. But the weather, the winds, and everything else is causing these. It was one of the main reasons to cause these high altitude precision bombing strikes that Hansell is an advocate of, that he was essentially raised to perform. It's just not going to work, and it's tried over and over and over again with the same results. There's, of course, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over multiple times and expecting a different result, and it happens over and over and over again. The Japanese are fairly quick to respond, and I said, in our notes yesterday, or in our email yesterday, we wouldn't get too specific into some of these missions, but this first one is notable for the fact that it is the first one over Tokyo since Doolittle, and that doesn't really count. But the Japanese were relatively quick to respond. We didn't receive the super high casualties that we thought we would receive on the raid, but yet the raid was a failure. Yet American press took that raid, because I think it was on Thanksgiving Day, wasn't it, in the United States? And they just blew this thing out of proportion. And it was only like 24 B-29s that hit Tokyo.
Yeah.
But this has a negative effect, that the press blowing this thing out of proportion has a negative effect on Hansell and the 21st Command, does it not?
Yeah, I want to back up real quick to you, because you touched on a couple of points that are worth blown up a little bit more, which is number one, it's the weather, and number two, the jet streams.
Yeah.
The weather in Japan is something that we had a really hard time predicting, and Japan has notoriously bad weather. And I lived there early on in my adulthood, and I remember it would rain for it felt like months at a time, and there's this constant give and take as an island nation between the sea and the sky, and it's cloudy, it's raining, and whatnot. And all of Hansel's concept of fighting is based on seeing your target. He does not believe in radar. He doesn't think radar is that efficient. He thinks it runs the risk of missing things and of hitting civilians and stuff like that. And so he's not a believer in radar. He's got to be able to see it. And of course, if you only have 5 or 6 or 7 days of clear weather, every month, you got to be able to time your missions around when those days are. And we don't have any ability to predict when that good weather is going to be. It's not like we have weather stations that we can call up in Tokyo and find out. And of course, the jet streams were a brand new issue, a challenge that we knew nothing about. And of course, the jet streams high in the skies over Japan blow at like 200 miles an hour. I mean, that's like the winds that batter the top of Mount Everest. And so for air crews, they literally just stall out in the skies over their target. And the challenge of that is that it means that they're easy targets of anti-aircraft fire. The flip side is if you go with you're just going to blow you right past your target before you ever even have time to line it up and do it. And so the combination of those two things adds to the half dozen other issues that Hansell is already contending with to make his job so much harder there. Going back, I forget what the question was exactly after that. I kind of wanted to hit that, which was the.
Oh, no. I was just talking about the press blitz.
Oh, yeah, the press blitz.
For lack of a better
what that
term,
does is that then adds, because at this point it builds the expectation that, and of course, if you look at the headlines of that time, super forts strike Tokyo and things like that. Suddenly there's going to be this huge expectation that the Americans are pummeling them. This is going to be over. And Hansell knows, particularly after the results of his first raid, that this is going to be a long, long road to victory, particularly if you're not hitting your target and you're not knocking these factories out. And of course, you got to remember the Japanese can quickly rebuild. They can, they have the potential to move things, to distribute their industry. They don't end up doing that, but that threat, that fear is always there. And so Hansell knows that if you get the public too worked up and you can't deliver results, it's going to backfire on it. And so that then adds yet another negative variable to what is becoming a pretty negative equation for him.
Yeah. So exactly to your point, post-raid photo analysis revealed that 248 bombs were dropped on the Musashino factory. 48 hit the target. And of those, 3 were duds. Yeah. So that ain't gonna get it done. Yeah.
I mean, within 2 weeks, they're back up and running at full capacity. I mean, it just does absolutely nothing to knock that. And of course, at that point, you've spent all this money on fuel, you've lost planes, you've lost airmen, and for nothing.
So spinning off of that first mission, that was a complete and utter dud. Not to be denied, Hansell's going to try again, as he should, at least a couple times, for San Antonio 2 and 3. Both of these missions attacked the exact same target, which was the Musashino factory. Both of these missions, San Antonio 2 and 3, were failures. On the second raid, weather forced the B-29s to divert to other targets. And on the third raid, 86 superforts went to the same target. 85% of the bombers attacked the factory, but only 2% of the bombs dropped actually hit it. So at this point, James, the Army Air Force's newest weapon, the B-29, the most expensive project of the war, American project of the war by far, was failing. It was a failure in the respect that it was designed to carry the war to Japan. Technically it is, but it's not doing anything. And there are many causes for the failures, but it's just, this is a big deal. And as we said earlier, Arnold's got this thing tied to his hip, and he's putting that thumb on the back of Hansell even harder and putting that pressure on even harder, because despite what the newspapers are saying, exactly to your point just a minute ago, that, B-29s are blasting Tokyo, the newspapers also start to report that things aren't as rosy, no pun intended, as they actually were first predicted. And that has a backwards effect on the whole campaign, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I'll tell you, it's interesting too. You can really see, even though there's, thousands and thousands of miles separate Washington from Saipan, you can look at the message traffic and see how Arnold is just really keeping Hansell on a very short leash. He's constantly Monday morning quarterbacking all of his missions. Why aren't you doing this? Why aren't you doing this? Why are so many planes aborting? You need to get to the bottom of that. Why aren't they hitting their target? And so, I mean, he's keeping very close tabs on what's going on there, because at the end of the day, Arnold's the one that has to report to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, how this new weapon is doing. And it's important to remember too that, this is a delicate time, heading from 44 into 45, the war in Germany, it's you've got the Battle of the Bulge, but then at that point, you're going to see the pretty quick collapse there after Germany. There's the stress of like, how are we, we're just now starting the air war against Japan. How long is this going to take? How are we going to keep American morale up and the public engaged for another long fight in the Pacific? Because if it's going to take, it took multiple years to finally knock Germany out, are we facing the same thing with Japan? And so, I mean, there's a broader context that's adding to the pressure that Arnold is now pushing on top of Haywood Hansell. And this is really going to be the context that's going to build up for his missions from November into December and into early January of 1945.
So he does have some success, not much, but he does have some success, Bill, when he shifts targets to a Mitsubishi plant in Nagoya. And this is a different target. So it does come with some different results, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Memphis 1, as it was called, pounded the target, killing over 200 workers, wounding many more. 15% of the plant was hit, and 20% more was seriously damaged. Production of airframes was cut significantly, but not stopped. More raids on Nagoya followed, but none were as successful as the first because the Japanese, react. I mean, you're not fighting a static enemy here. And on December 27th, the 29s hit Musashino again with pathetic results. So it's kind of like, same verse, as bad as the first here. And then that adds to fuel to the fire, quite literally, about what's going to happen next.
Yeah. So firebombing was, I put in the notes, is taboo in polite circles, at least in those days in the United States Army Air Forces. But it was a known tactic in World War II. It had been used in Europe, as we said earlier, extensively, specifically by the RAF against German cities. And just to be 100% clear, the United States Army 8th Air Forces also did drop incendiaries over German cities. But as we said earlier, men like Hansell were absolutely appalled at that idea. They did not want to have anything to do with it whatsoever, because it went against everything that they had taught and they believed in. Now, Hansell is ordered to do a test raid, fire raid against Japan at this stage, against Nagoya specifically. And Hansell suspected at one point, and I pulled this out of your book, that there was a shift in tactics beginning to take root within the Army Air Forces at that time. And again, vehemently opposed to these attacks, there was indeed a shift, or at least a thought process going on, because, James, the Army Air Forces had been conducting tests on, and I use air quotes on here, Japanese cities that they were built in the United States to test these very tactics. And can you tell us about some of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, Hansell's suspicions were accurate. I mean, the U.S. is very much leaning and really driving in that direction. And it really actually goes all the way back to July 4th, 1942, when the U.S. tests a brand new flame weapon on the soccer field at Harvard. I mean, we were developing incendiary weapons. Of course, that flame weapon is napalm, which is going to, become a common word in nowadays. But back then, it was a brand new substance that's going to really lead to the ultimate destruction of Japanese cities. In addition to that, of course, we developed the B-29, and then more than that, we were really looking at ways to test it. And so what we did is to sort of test that napalm. We built mock German and Japanese villages in the deserts of Utah and Duohet Proving Ground. And over the summer of 1943, we burned down these villages over and over and over again. And we actually built these villages. We literally brought in one of the proteges of Frank Lloyd Wright, who had spent a lot of time doing development in Japan. He'd actually done the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. It's because we wanted these things to be accurate, real representations of what Japanese towns and cities look like. And so, I mean, we literally built them down to the same materials, the tatami flooring, same type of furniture that was used in them, the same distances that would separate, homes across alleys and towns and cities, streets from one another. So we could get a real sense of just how good this weapon would really be. Now, it's important to note, though, that, of course, the construction of this mock town and the tests that were done there didn't happen in a vacuum. I mean, at the same time, planners were actively studying the makeup and construction of Japanese cities in order to figure out, incendiary zones. And one of the things they looked at is there was a big earthquake in 1923 called the Great Kanto earthquake, and it actually was closer into Yokohama. The earthquake took place right in the waterway, but it led to a huge. It happened right around midday, and it led to all these fires, and it burned up much of Tokyo and Yokohama, killed over 100,000 people, and it really kind of served as it reveals sort of the Achilles heel, so to speak, of Japanese construction, which is that if you put a torch to these things, they will burn. And so, in the course of World War II, we actually interviewed overseas insurance adjusters to kind of determine and get their take on sort of what made Tokyo burn. I mean, we kind of studied this fire from 1923 to figure out how we could apply those tactics to contemporary warfare. And of course, what we did is we developed target folders for every single city in Japan based on incendiary zones. Incendiary zone 1, 2, and 3 based on, incendiary zone 1 would be most flammable, 2 a little bit less, 3 even more so. But the idea was that every single city then could have target areas based on combustibility. And so you sort of see this dual track going on, which is the development of flame weapons, the testing of them in the bomber, and then also the planning process that's going on. So what's happening for Hansell at that point is they're asking him to start testing this. Say, all right, we've now developed the weapon, we've got the bomber, we've put together the data. Let's see how well this works. And he is resistant to that because, again, as we talked about earlier in the show, that's just not who he is. That goes against everything about him. But the pressure from Washington is building for this change of tactics. And particularly now that you've seen, his missions throughout November and December are total bust. And they're thinking, man, if we can't knock out a single factory after flying, 8 missions round trip over Japan, this air war is going to go on for years. And the American public does not have the patience for that. We fought a long war in Europe. We're ready to wrap this thing up. Germany's going to collapse in the not too distant future. We don't have 4 more years to fight again in the Pacific. We got to speed this thing up. And that's what's building. That's the pressure wave that is building on Hansell at that point.
He doesn't do himself any favors either when he gives a report to he basically gives a press conference on December 27th, 1944, where we don't need to get into every word, but for all intents and purposes, he says that we're not doing so good. Things aren't going as well as initially people were thinking. We're having to hit the same targets over and over again. It's a learning process. It's an experimentation, all this other stuff. While he's 100% correct, that is not what Hap Arnold wanted put out to the world's press. To your point exactly, to the American populace who are like, get this show on the road. And Arnold, who's like, get this show on the road. Hansell, that's pretty much, he signs his own death warrant right there at that point. That's pretty much it after that.
Yep, he's also saying stuff you don't want the enemy to know.
Right, exactly. Yeah, right. Yeah. Which they could read, by the way.
And for Hansell, it's kind of like almost like this confession, like, I'm a failure, I can't do this, and I can't do that, I can't do this. And you're like, dude, shut up.
Yeah.
And Arnold's furious. It just lights a fuse on Arnold. And that's it. That's the end of Hansell at that point. And what's funny is, of course, Arnold ultimately cans him at that point. And then Hansell sends him like this 10-page letter, like this soul-searching letter about, I could have done this better, I could have done. And again, it's all in the character of who Haywood Hansell was. I mean, he's this kind-hearted guy. He's a thinker and intellectual. I wrote in the book, I said he was a planner, not a predator. And so he wrestles with all these things. And Hap Arnold doesn't care about any of that stuff at this point. No. Just wants results. Exactly. And at that point, he's like, all right, you're out.
Yep.
He's flown 8 missions over less than 2 months, and he's done.
Yeah. Yeah. And well, he's not getting it done. He had one semi-successful raid, and that was it. And you said he was a planner and not a predator. Well, that's the perfect segue into the gentleman who replaces him, who had the maybe unfortunate nickname of Iron Ass, and that is Curtis LeMay. James, lay it on us about Curtis. I think Curtis LeMay hung the moon, but go ahead and lay it on us about
I'll
Curtis
say how much
LeMay.
time we got. I mean, LeMay, I remember when I was writing the book, I set out to kind of write, this little bit on LeMay. It ended up being like 10,000 words, by the time I was
He's an
done.
incredible person, or he was anyway.
He really is a fascinating person. And LeMay, in short, is everything Haywood Hansell is not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, personality-wise, view shed-wise, background-wise, they're just complete opposites. And whereas Hansell sort of grown up, the son of an Army officer, and he had a pretty privileged lifestyle and things like that. LeMay grew up dirt poor in Ohio. His dad was a ne'er-do-well who kind of bounced from one manual labor job to the next. His mother, who had the highest level of education in the household, she'd only made it through the 8th grade. LeMay, learned at a very early age that he had no one in life to depend on but himself. And I will tell you, LeMay is one of those. I think it's a lot of people look at him through the lens of Vietnam, and they look at him through the lens of Dr. Strangelove, and they look at him as a caricature, and that is a major mischaracterization of this guy. I mean, he was a incredibly hardworking and incredibly important thinker about war during World War II, incredibly tenacious. And his story is a tough one. I mean, there's a line he writes at one point, I think in his memoir, when he says, look, he had to work and put himself through school. I mean, in high school, nobody gave him any money. It's like his parents didn't care about him. His teachers didn't care about him. If he basically worked jobs as a high school student. He said, I was laying in bed one night, and maybe I thought about all the dances I missed and the football games I didn't go to and the social life I never had. But most nights I just laid there and I was just too damn tired to care. And that's kind of that exhaustion from just tireless work is what is going to ultimately follow LeMay for decades, because he works all the time. In fact, he puts himself through college, the only person from his family at that point to go to college, by working all night in a steel mill. Jesus. I mean, literally works until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning at a steel mill, sleeps for a few hours, goes to school. I mean, somehow manages to find time to get all that stuff done. I mean, it's just, and so the point is, by the time he actually finally gets through college and he gets into the Air Force and stuff like that, he's an incredibly socially awkward individual. It's because he's never had an opportunity to be in
out in the world
situations.
Right.
And he finally joins the engineering fraternity in college. And the guys are like, they make him go take dancing lessons. They're like, dude, you're never going to get married if you don't learn how to dance and stuff like that. And he ultimately ends up, he falls in love. He does get married. And I'll tell you, his wife proves to be the great counterbalance to him in life, because she did have all the social grace and whatnot. And particularly as LeMay got older and he rose up through the ranks, he became a general. And his wife really ended up being sort of the family liaison for a lot of those kind of situations. And of course, he did learn over time and things like that. But as a young man, he was incredibly rough around the edges. He was pudgy. He worked all the time. He was just, he had to do everything for himself. And so that sort of, it developed in him sort of a realism and a pragmatism and a dependence upon himself that's going to fuel him throughout. And ultimately, of course, like Hansell, he's going to begin in fighters. He's going to gravitate over toward to bombers. He's going to go to Europe and fight. And of course, in Europe is where he's really going to demonstrate, where it's all going to kind of come together and make a difference. It's important to note, LeMay, or right before he goes to Europe, he wakes up one day and he's got one side of his face
Bell's palsy.
Bell's palsy. Realizes he goes to the flight surgeon, realizes he's got Bell's palsy. And so he's going to hide that by chewing on a cigar. And that's going to become sort of that indelible image of LeMay, the cigar and whatnot. But he used that to kind of hide the residual effects of the Bell's palsy. Bell's palsy is going to leave him with really bad headaches too for the rest of the war. And you're going to see that if you read his letters. And fortunately, like Hansell, all his letters he wrote home have been preserved. You go through his personal letters and you see that the residual effects that he suffered from that. Anyway, it's in Europe where he is going to sort of really kind of come into his own as a combat leader. He had started off in artillery, so he understood flak and things like that. He's going to use those early lessons from artillery to sort of deconstruct German flak scenarios. And in doing so, he's going to realize that German flak is far less accurate than people realize, therefore allowing his bombers to spend more time over the target without being afraid of getting shot down. He's going to design some revolutionary formations for planes, for the B-17 so that they can maximize their defenses. And he's going to end up having really, really great success. And his superiors are going to start taking notice of him. And he's going to kind of rise up the ranks that way. So much so that when Hansell ultimately gets terminated, LeMay is the one who's picked to transition over from Europe to the Pacific to take his place. And one thing I'll add about LeMay too is, he literally spent the whole war overseas, and it came at great personal cost to him and his family. I mean, there's one great anecdote when he comes back, when he's transitioning from Europe to the Pacific Theater, and he comes back home, spends a few days with his family in Ohio, and he's got a young daughter at this point, Janie, and Janie grabs him by the hand, insists on him coming outside. And of course, you got to remember, this is January 1945. It's freezing cold out in Ohio. She makes him sit on the porch. You swing, 10 minutes pass, 20 minutes, then half an hour. He's begging her to go back inside. She's refusing. Finally, after about an hour, they're near approaching, frostbite. They head back inside. And it's later his wife who says to him, the reason she wanted you to sit outside is because she was trying to prove to all the other kids on the block that she actually had a dad, because he'd been gone so long. And so, that really speaks to just how much he gave. And then you look at his letters throughout the war. The constant theme in all of his letters are his exhaustion. I mean, he's constantly writing, maybe when the war's over, I'll finally get a good night's sleep, or, he's just really, he's a tireless worker. And of course, that is who Hap Arnold is going to turn to remedy the problems that Hansell is unable to solve in the Pacific.
Well, tireless worker, good way to put it, because he's got his work cut out for him. When he gets over there to take over from Hansell, he's got the same, or most of the same issues that Hansell had that he did not or could not fix when Hansell took over the operation in October 1944. One of the issues was, as he said himself, Hansell's staff was worthless, absolutely worthless. He didn't trust them, he didn't believe in them, and they were just not what he felt a good staff should be. He also had issues with Rosie O'Donnell initially, anyway, noting the lack of discipline and the aborted flights throughout these missions, that there's so many B-29s turning around for whatever reason that reason may be. He took special note of the latter, specifically the aborts, and he had to say, he sets up a different way of doing things. He sets up basically a 24-hour-a-day mechanical maintenance, arming, refueling system on these islands that does indeed improve the effective rate of the B-29s. But even then, another issue he had, Bill, and I'm passing this one to you for obvious reasons, was that even now in January of 1945, the basis from which he was going to fly, or the basis from which they were flying, were woefully behind in development, even at this stage.
Yeah, there's truth in this, Seth, and I hate to admit it, but because this falls in Nimitz's lap. Hap Arnold created a special air force for these B-29s so that they wouldn't fall under the dominion of the Navy or Nimitz or MacArthur, and that was successful to the extent that Nimitz and MacArthur didn't have operational control of the Air Force assets. But it also meant that they were relegated to like third-tier status when it came to construction. And because the construction assets were mostly Navy, still in theater right now. And so the Navy drug their feet, I'm going to say it that way, on constructing legitimate barracks, legitimate workshops, things like that. Even, as you said earlier, bunkers to store the bombs and things like that. And by this point, Nimitz had moved his headquarters from Pearl Harbor to Guam. We talked about that in an earlier episode, up to what we now call the top of the Marianas, or top of the Mar. And so Nimitz invites this new guy, LeMay, to his quarters for dinner. And LeMay is noticing they're having cocktails. We talked about the sink pack, Nimitz's invention of a cocktail drink, and they're having steaks, and the Navy guys are in their choker whites, their undress whites, we would call, and just LeMay is looking at all of this askance, and he says, I want to return the favor. Why don't you come and eat with me? When you get the chance. So they do. And LeMay sits him down in the tent galley, or, and feeds him K rations or C rations or whatever it is they're eating to make a point. And I think the point was effective. And Nimitz lit a fire under his construction folks, and things started moving. But yeah, it was a fair complaint.
He had a quote that I thought it was hysterical. LeMay wrote, I don't know if he wrote it in a letter home or he wrote it in his diary or whatever, but he said, because he goes to that first party, I guess, for lack of a better term, and all the Nimitz's people are, resplendent in their Navy whites. And he walks in like a rumpled khaki uniform, and he says, I felt like a skunk at a family reunion. Yeah. That's a great quote. I need to use that from time to time. So, but James, getting back to the issue at hand, he starts basically at the beginning. Once LeMay gets over there, he realizes that his people are inadequately trained, that they're not cutting the mustard to his level of perfection, which is to say ultimate perfection. So he starts at the beginning, and he essentially retrains a lot of these guys, and makes them fly training missions and milk runs to truck and places like that to just get the basics at hand. And it pisses a lot of these guys off because they're thinking, oh, we're here to fly missions and all this other stuff, and now they're taking their life in their own hands when they fly these training missions, and they're not, it doesn't of course count against their tally to go home. But it was something that absolutely had to be done because these guys weren't getting it done. They just were not getting it done. And LeMay, much to your point, as you said a little while ago, he was an operator. He wasn't the planner. He was the predator. And he's in there trying to realize that, trying to fix the situation, realizing that he has a serious issue in his hands. So he starts making waves almost as soon as he hits the ground, doesn't he?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I compare it. It's like the other day I had to help my mom with she couldn't get her printer to connect to her computer, and so I was like, all right, you got to start at the basics. You got to unplug everything and then start plugging everything back in and make sure everything's connected right. And that's effectively kind of the approach LeMay takes here, which is, okay, the system's not working. Let's tear it down and start over at the basics. Okay, let's create schools for pilots, navigators, bombardiers. Let's get them going. Let's completely revamp the maintenance system here. Let's keep these, as he always said, you can't bomb a city from the ground. So you got to redo that. Radar, Hansell didn't like it. I love it. Let's start training these guys. They start sending radio operators over from Europe. He literally just starts attacking it from every single angle. Because remember, he's an engineer. His mind works that way, right? Let's figure out what the problem is and let's solve it. And then what he also does is he goes from 30,000 feet to 25,000 feet. Just enough to bring him down where he thinks he's underneath. He's going to see where that cloud cover is. He's going to see where those jet streams are. And he's going to see if that works. And that's what he's going to do. He's going to essentially spend the next few weeks tinkering and trying to sort of see if he can still work within the framework of American doctrine, which is how to daylight precision bombing. But if there's a way in which I can tinker with it to fix the problems at hand. And so that's going to be how he spends literally his first 4 to 6 weeks there, is just trying to problem solve, troubleshoot,
trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And I mean, he doesn't. I think the key here too, also a second key to take away from this, is that his results, LeMay's results, his first several raids are not any better than Possum Hansell's raids. Even though he's dropping the altitude down some and there's better formation flying and all this other stuff. Mm-hmm. His results aren't much better than Hansell's at all. And Hap Arnold still got those thumbs. Now he's got 2 thumbs pushing on the back of LeMay's neck, saying, and I like this, and I've read this in several places, is that, Hap Arnold laid the really nice, line to LeMay specifically. And he said, oh, hey, by the way, if you don't help bring Japan to her knees through this strategic bombing campaign, we're going to have to invade. And those, 500,000 to 1 million casualties are on your shoulders, buddy. Yeah. So again, no pressure here. Get the job done. So they do eventually start to get better results over time. Bombing from the lower altitudes helped, but it also increased American casualties because Japanese AAA, while it wasn't as good as German AAA, it was there. And it did start to bring down some of these B-29s here and there. The B-29s are also, much like the early B-17 raids, mainly because we had no place to put them until we captured Iwo Jima, are flying unescorted missions in the broad daylight, which of course opens them up to Japanese fighter attacks, which, by the way, they do launch fighter attacks against our B-29s. Nothing like the Luftwaffe, but still they are doing this and they are bringing down B-29s in increasing numbers. So can you get into it? Well, suffice all this to say that his results are not what he wants them to be. Arnold is putting pressure on him. He knows something has to change. LeMay does, and this is about February 1945, right around Iwo Jima. Actually, I think it's February 19th. What are his thoughts? Kurt LeMay's thoughts on firebombing. We already talked about Hansell. What are LeMay's thoughts on firebombing?
He's got no problem with it. I mean, as we know, he and Hansell had looked over the after-action reports and photographs of Hamburg in July 43 and had come out of it with two very different takes. Whereas Hansell was repulsed by it, LeMay was like, work. Amid all that ruin is industry. And so therefore there's success there. And so he has no moral problem with it. I mean, LeMay is I like to say he's a spreadsheet fighter. And by that, everything it goes into a column. And he has this famous line, he goes, in war, you got to kill enough people. When you finally kill enough of them, they stop fighting. Exactly. And that is kind of how he viewed everything. And that is sort of the philosophy he brings to the Pacific War, which is, at the end of the day, it's a numbers game. And so he doesn't have a problem with it. In fact, his comments are pretty blunt, even when he eventually burns Tokyo, in which he says, we knew we were going to kill a lot of women and kids. We had to do it. I mean, he's just matter of fact about it. And so that's kind of his approach to it. So he doesn't have a big problem with it. In fact, he starts at this point realizing, after he's done all of his troubleshooting of, maintenance, altitude, pilot and training, all that, like, hey, this system just doesn't work. 2 + 2 here does not equal 4. And we're going to have to reinvent the equation for how best to attack Japan. And so he starts brewing and thinking about all of that. And of course, meanwhile, the pressure is building in Washington and whatnot. And of course, as we know, the inertia in Washington is increasingly pushing toward firebombing. And of course, with LeMay, they've got their man who's willing to do that. And so, and that, of course, is where this battle and this war are heading.
Exactly. On February the 25th, LeMay sends 172 B-29s to Tokyo at 22,000 feet in daytime, but it's on a fire mission. This is an incendiary raid. The raid, which was on a Sunday, lit over 24 fires across the southern portion of the city near Sumida. 27,970 homes, businesses, and other buildings go up in flames. For the next 2 days, and this is exactly to your point you made way at the beginning, Tokyo's inner-city transportation system in that area is completely paralyzed by this really small fire raid. So at that point, after the post-strike mission photos are looked at, LeMay realizes, yeah, this will work. We can do this. If we can do this on a large scale, and we can do something very, very drastic, very different than what we've normally done in the past, and complete this task the way I envision it in my head, we can change the course of this campaign overnight. And that is exactly, to your point, James, this is where the idea starts to brew in his mind for ultimately what becomes, of course, Operation Meetinghouse. So he is sick and tired of dealing with the winds and the weather over Japan. Kurt LeMay. He's about had enough of this stuff. And he wants to get as many fire bombs on target as physically possible. M69 incendiaries to be exact. When he wants to do that, or how he wants to do this, is at a low altitude. And by low altitude, I'm talking low altitude, 5 to 9,000 feet, in staggered formations for the B-29, an airplane that was designed to fly in excess of 30,000 feet. How revolutionary we all know this, but let's hear it. How revolutionary was this idea to bring these massive strategic bombers in at 5,000 feet? Oh, and by the way, at night over the capital city of Japan. How just blows people's minds when he lets people know about this.
Well, it does, and it is very revolutionary at that point because for so long America had flown high altitude daylight precision raids, but every change he makes then results in another change. And so the idea of like, all right, if I've got to get from 25,000 or 30,000 feet down underneath the cloud cover and whatnot, I'm just going to go all the way down. I'm going to just guaranteed. And so he drops them down. Well, if you're going to drop them down, you're going to expose them to enemy aircraft fire, enemy flak fighters. So, of course, they don't have, as you noted earlier, there's no fighter escort. So how are we going to protect them? Well, we'll fly at night. We will go from formation flying to single, we'll scatter everybody out and things like that. So every change has sort of a complementary change that goes with it that helps sort of create the mission that becomes Operation Meetinghouse. And of course, underlying all this is his wise assumption that this will be the equivalent of an aerial sucker punch the Japanese won't see coming because they're so used to us coming high altitude during the day and whatnot that they will be totally blindsided if we come in the middle of the night at low altitude. And by the time they're able to sort of readjust their guns, get their planes in the air and all that, we're out of there. And so so he's really banking on the element of surprise as well. And again, getting in low like that guarantees, he can get his incendiaries on the ground. He can get those fires going. As we talked about earlier, these are weapons that have been tested in this type of environment. He's got dossiers on every single city, show these flammable zones. All he's got to do is write an operational order based around where that highest density wooden construction is, and then just go burn it. And that's effectively what he does.
He takes this on his own shoulders too. He writes, and I thought this was pretty cool, really, the way he does this, is that he makes sure that when he comes up with this idea that there's really no, if it fails, it's on him alone. If it succeeds, it's also on him. But if it fails, it's on him alone because it's so secretive the way he goes about this. He has a direct conversation with Lawrence Norstad, about this whole operation. And without actually conferring with Arnold directly, he basically takes what Norstad says, which is essentially whatever you got to do, just get it done, as a, yep, okay, I can do this. And he does this. He plans this operation, which, as we said, coming in low at night with a whole force of B-29s to drop incendiaries over Tokyo and burn out the cottage industry, which is spread out across Tokyo, like I put in the notes, like a spider's web, and it is, as well as doing what ultimately he said he would have to do, which is kill people. And when you kill enough of them, they're going to quit fighting. So when he cuts the orders for this mission and he issues the orders out, and then they go out to all the groups, the pilots and the crews have a coronary because they see altitude as their safety net, for lack of a better term. And now you're dropping me down to 5,000 feet. And we're going in at night, the flak is going to tear us to shreds. This is a serious issue with the crews, isn't it?
Yeah, it very much is, because again, this is not what these guys are trained for. I mean, this is not they're they get used to something. They've been doing it one way, and then he comes in here and he completely shakes up. And for most of them, it's a suicide mission. They're convinced that they're coming in low, they're going to be exposed. But LeMay, and even LeMay's own intelligence officers are telling him, and operational officers, like, hey, you could end up losing 70% of your force on this. But he thinks otherwise. He's studied the photos. He doesn't see a lot of night guns. He doesn't see any ability of the Japanese to operate in these type of conditions. And again, he really falls back on that. The element of surprise will be in and out of Tokyo before they can even respond. And that really is sort of his guiding view of what's going to protect these guys.
And that is exactly what happens. Bill, tell us about what the 325 B-29s would do on that March 9th, 10th raid over Tokyo.
Well, Seth, out of those 329, 279 would actually reach the target. And over the course of the night, those 279 B-29s dropped 1,665, not bombs, 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs. The bombs and the fires that were started by those bombs and then fueled by the wood and paper houses and other bombs and the tinderbox of the buildings that was Tokyo. It completely razed, R-A-Z-E-D, approximately 16 square miles of the city. Over 267,000 buildings were destroyed. Over 1 million people were left homeless. So this was significant. You know, starting from Meetinghouse Hour does not lie the number of the buildings destroyed within the number of humans killed. Initial Japanese estimates put the death toll at over 84,000 people killed. Estimates post-war would bring that number upwards of 110,000. But even during the war, you said LeMay's one of his famous sayings was, you win a war by killing people. When you kill enough of them, they stop fighting. Another one of his famous sayings was, if we don't win this war, I'm going to be tried as a war criminal. So he was under no delusions about the impact that was happening here and how it would affect his own personal reputation, Seth, to your point. He wasn't looking for top cover in this at all. He was taking it all on himself, but he believed that, but if we could do something to keep from having to invade, it would be worth it, guys.
Yeah, no doubt. And the raid is successful. It's declared a massive success, in so much as you can declare something like that a massive success. 22 targeted industrial sites in Tokyo are wiped out, as well as the lives of, depending on who you read, 84 to 100,000 people. Warehouses for food distribution. This goes back to what you were saying earlier, James. Warehouses for food distribution, clothing storage, household items, all that kind of stuff are also collateral damage, and they're burned to a cinder within inside of Tokyo, putting even more stress on a civilian population that was already under tremendous stress because they were being starved out by the American naval blockade being conducted by United States Navy submarines. So this is a huge, huge thing. But on top of all that, it also makes the Japanese people realize that all that propaganda they've been pumping into us for the last several years is malarkey, to put it mildly, because Japanese civilians themselves realize after Tokyo is, burned to a crisp, or at least part of it, there's no way we can win this war. So this one raid has a tremendous effect on the way that the Japanese now view the war and the way that we are going to prosecute this air war, James.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, this is sort of the fulcrum on which the air war shifts, and it doesn't go back at that point. And to your point about the Japanese, you're absolutely right. Word will spread throughout all Japanese communities. What happened to Tokyo? What happened to Tokyo? What happened to Tokyo? And as LeMay continues to then burn other cities, that's going to continue. Tokyo will, of course, be the most important one, because Tokyo really gets at the heart of Japanese culture. It is the political, educational, commercial, cultural hub of so much of Japanese life that it's going to reverberate throughout, and it is going to lead to one of the most important byproducts of this. It's going to be sort of the depopulation of Japan's key urban areas. And it's not just, the 1 million people that leave Tokyo, or it's actually going to end up in the end being about 8.5 million people who are going to flee out of Japan's cities. And of course, that is the labor source that you need to continue in these factories. You're going to create societal disruption and the burdening of your rural areas, which are going to then suddenly find themselves having to take in all these people's food. At this point is already scarce in Japan. The average person surviving off about 1,600 calories a day. Figuring out where your next meal's coming from it takes a lot of work.
It's a serious problem.
Now you're suddenly going to be burdening these communities with all of these sort of these transplants, these exiles, and so it's going to create that societal disruption.
2 days after Tokyo, LeMay continues with the fire raid. This is not just a one and done thing. He's going to bring the thunder literally for the next, well over a week, and then continue it after that. He sends his night flyers to Nagoya, which had been attacked 7 times previously, but had yet to suffer any kind of serious damage. 285 superforts hit Nagoya with 1,790 tons of M69s without suffering a single loss. The destruction in Nagoya was nowhere near what had been experienced in Tokyo during Meetinghouse, but it was still significant. And 2 square miles of the city had been destroyed. LeMay even says disappointing by new standards, and it was at that, after March 10th, it was. But he did something different. He tried staggering the flyers coming in at different intervals and what it actually did, as opposed to theoretically overwhelming the Japanese firefighters. It gave them time to control and contain the fires. So like I put in your book, you put it, lesson learned. So after that, he's like, nah, we ain't gonna do that again. Let's just dump it all on him at one time. And that's exactly what he does. On March 13th, which is the day after, he mirrored Meetinghouse's tactics in a raid on Osaka, zeroing in on a 10 square mile area where the population density was the heaviest at over 75,000 people per square mile. 274 B-29s dropped on 1,733 tons of fire bombs from 9,000 feet, burning 8 square miles, killing nearly 4,000 people, wounding another 8,600, and wiping out 4,000 industrial buildings and 134,000 residential buildings, leaving 500,000 people homeless. I mean, these are earth-shattering air raids that are occurring over Japan right now. Dresden was obviously a horrible thing. Hamburg was not a good thing either. But those pale in comparison to what is going on over Japan right now.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, that's the thing is in the horror it creates on the ground in Japan is and when I was doing the book, I interviewed survivors and what it was like in these firestorms, what it was like afterwards. I mean, you don't have the infrastructure to deal with this, and it's not just okay. You're literally 1 out of 4 buildings in Tokyo are burned, but you don't have much in the way of medical facilities at that point. You don't have a way to dispose of bodies at that point. I mean, you don't have there are bodies everywhere. They're in the canals, they're in the river. People are searching for loved ones. They're dealing with their own injuries and sickness and things like that. And so it's just the societal disruption and the horror it creates for the people on the ground is just tremendous. And you're never going to see, I will say Tokyo is the worst in terms of the death from the fire bombings. You're not going to see, even as other cities get burned, you're not going to see the high fatalities again until Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I think a lot of that's because people get out. They say, you know what, we're out of here, we're done. And later in the war, of course, later in the air war, LeMay is going to start warning people, these cities are the ones we're going to target, and it gives people an opportunity to get out of the way. And so, it does. It's a hugely transformative thing for Japan, for Japanese culture, society at that point. It also, of course, it sends a message to the United States finally see their way to end the war. And LeMay sees this. If we've got to hurry up and end this thing before an invasion, of course, which at that point was preliminarily planned for Kyushu in the fall of 1945 with the Tokyo Plain in March of 46. Now you see a path forward to try and use air power to bring it into the war before you have to invade. And as we know now from Ultra and decrypts and things like that, Japan was really girding for a huge fight on Kyushu. There would have been high casualties for Americans and for the Japanese as well. And so the clock is on to prevent this titanic ground war that is ultimately going to come as the Americans prepare for the actual invasion of the Japanese homeland.
Yeah. And he's not done. He's not done.
No.
On the 16th of March, he hits Kobe, killing 2,500 people, burning nearly 3 square miles. On the 18th of March, Nagoya is hit again, burning out another 3 square miles. And at this point, he literally runs out of munitions. He's running out of bombs to drop. Bill, LeMay's B-29s burned an incredible 32 square miles of Japan's largest cities. Tell us a little bit more about some of the details on this.
Yeah, to your point earlier, Seth, the 5 raids killed more than 110,000 men, women, and children, wounded another 60,000, left 2 million people homeless. LeMay said of the destruction, I wasn't happy about it, but neither was I particularly concerned about civilian casualties. I didn't let it influence any of my decisions because we knew how the Japanese treated Americans, both civilian and military, when they captured the Philippines, places like the Philippines. So he knew that a lot of Japanese civilians were going to die in an invasion. So one way or another, he was just going to try to accelerate the inevitable. The human toll was terrific, but so was the toll taken on the Japanese industry and war-making ability. Public transportation deteriorated in most cities, especially Osaka, which limited the amount of people who could attend work, if work still existed in the first place. Food distribution was wrecked in most cities within the fire zone. Communication ability was destroyed in most areas as well. The B-29s had indeed destroyed the city's ability to function as a part of the Japanese war industry in many ways. So to that extent, this strategic bombing campaign was now proving successful.
Very much so. How close, James, was Japan to breaking in March of 45 after this Blitz week, we'll call it? I mean, they just raised Japan in those raids.
Yeah, not very close, actually. I mean, I think the public was, but I think the leadership wasn't. And I think that's the dual track that you see throughout, the last year of the war with Japan, which is the population suffering tremendously, but the 8 people making the decisions for Japan still want to continue to press on, and including Hirohito. Yep. And Hirohito actually goes out and tours the bombed areas about a week afterwards, and so he sees it firsthand, and yet they continue to fight on because their whole thing is going to be, if we continue to prosecute this war and we can eventually get a better position at the bargaining table, we can preserve the imperial structure, population be damned. And so you're going to see that this suffering is going to continue as March rolls into April and into May because of that. And the suffering is tremendous. I mean, it's horrific what's going on there for these people, and their government knows it. It's happening. They're allowing it to continue to go. And so it just, that's the reality of it.
Yeah. And after he burns out these big cities, and he's going to return to these cities multiple times too, by the way, it's not a one and done thing on Tokyo at all. After he burns out these big cities, he goes to secondary targets. LeMay's picking off these smaller towns on the list of target priorities. And to your point exactly, sometimes he sends out notes saying, hey, we're coming. Talk about put the fear of God into people, huh? Jesus, good God. You can think about that for just a second. It just popped in my head. I mean, if you're sitting there and, some small town or small city in Japan, and you get a leaflet dropped over you by an American B-29 that you don't even know what the hell that thing is in the first place, that the leaflet says, oh, hey, by the way, we just burned out, half of Tokyo and we killed 100,000 people. We're coming for you next, so you better get out. Talk about put the fear of God into people. Good Lord.
Yeah. And what LeMay did too is, he put these leaflets out and it had like a dozen different cities on them. And he said, by the 2 days from now, 4 of these cities aren't going to exist anymore. But I'm not going to tell you which 4.
Right.
It was his way of kind of emptying out multiple cities because people are like, do I play this game of Russian roulette and see if it's going to be me or whoever gets it next? And that's kind of the psychological warfare game he was playing. But of course, later on, as he starts fanning out and hitting multiple cities, of course, the Japanese can't keep up. They don't have enough artillery guns or aircraft guns to be able to spread out their air defenses and whatnot. And so by this point, the air crews are getting no pushback whatsoever from the Japanese, from fighters or anti-aircraft guns. And so really they just have free reign to kind of sort of prowl all over the Japanese homeland and burn the cities.
So at the end of all of this, though, after burning out, dig on this for a second, 56.3 miles of Tokyo, 56.3 square miles of Tokyo. Good Lord. 15.6 of Osaka, 12.4 of Nagoya, 8.9 of Yokohama, 8.8 of Kobe, and 3.6 of Kawasaki. That's when LeMay decides to move on to these smaller targets. And as you said, James, a lot of these targets, these smaller targets, and Bill, they had no way to defend themselves. They really didn't have much of an industry there. They would burn. And that was the key, is that they were going to burn. His campaign, LeMay's campaign, lasts only 159 days from start to finish. 159 days. And that's not to say that he flew 159 fire missions or even 150. No, it's from start to finish. It was 159 days. In that time, LeMay's B-29s burned 178 square miles of 66 cities. Half of the incendiaries dropped on Japan landed on Nagoya, Osaka, Yokohama, and Kobe. Of the secondary cities, and I found this to be appalling here myself, I got to be honest, Toyama was wiped off the face of the earth when 99.5% of the city was burnt down. That's everything. I mean, that's gone. There is nothing left in Toyama after that raid. That's incredible. I did not know that, honest to God, until I started going through the final figures in the back end of your book. I saw that and my my jaw hit the floor. That was incredible. Absolutely incredible. It's a lot to digest. It's a lot to digest. Over three. Go ahead.
I think an important point is that it's not just LeMay that's doing it. Like the American public slowly comes on board with this.
Yes.
And I do think this
because the news is pumping this stuff too.
Yeah, and I think this is sort of the gradual, because when LeMay first sets out and burns Tokyo, there's a lot of fear. So how's the American public going to respond to this? And how are lawmakers going to respond, and editorial pages and radio broadcasters? And as they see the response is positive. I mean, Time Magazine says, properly kindled, Japanese cities will burn like the autumn leaves. And so as that summer campaign, those 159 days pass and the American public becomes more and more desensitized to it, it really sets up those two strikes, the atomic strikes, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so that, that there's no hesitation to then use, this city busting weapon when it finally becomes available.
Yeah, it's up to that point. I said earlier that the strategy was successful. It was successful in that it achieved its objectives, which was destruction of industry, reduction of civilian population who could work in industry and things like that. As we later learned, and we did 2 episodes on this, it was not successful in terms of, as the point James was making, in terms of convincing Japanese leadership that this war was over and they ought to just give up. That didn't happen until the atomic bombs were dropped.
Yeah, sure. Here's though, I think there's room for nuance in that they knew the war. I mean, because there's a difference between
after the Marianas, they knew
defeat and surrender. I mean, surrender is a political decision. And as the cities are burning, there is increasing fear amongst the Japanese leaders of this is our fate. This is just going to keep happening. There's no way to end this. And I do think when it finally comes around to the atomic bombs, they're like, aha, we can use this as sort of a face-saving way out. So it's excuse, so to speak. So I think it's successful in the point that they're desperately looking for some way to bring about an end to the war. And that's where the atomic bomb sort of piggybacks off of that. And so I think there is some success in there. And I think, and I also think that, quite frankly, the atomic bomb is a continuation of the air campaign. These aren't separate. These are still strategic bombing operations. I mean, yet you're switched out your weapon and whatnot, but I mean, is the atomic bomb any more horrific than firebombing or different than firebombing? I mean, Tokyo, from a property destruction standpoint, firebombing is far more destructive. I mean, Tokyo, 15.8 square miles in a single raid. Hiroshima, 4.4. Nagasaki, a little over 2. Yes, the death results are going to be larger, particularly once the long-term factor of radiation sickness is factored in. But initially, more people die in Tokyo from the firebombing. And so I think, there's a tendency of people to try to separate these two, when I think, if anything, they're really part of the same campaign.
It's absolutely
different weapons.
Agreed.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but especially Hiroshima, it's a high altitude precision strike.
Yeah, well, but
you
see the revisionist historians have tried to argue that that Hiroshima and Nagasaki are kind of their own thing, and they're really not. I mean, they're just the last stop on this air campaign. And so
Certainly, in his viewpoint, it was just more efficient. I mean, it was going to take one bomb instead of 10,000 bombs, and are they going to be any deader if they're killed with an atomic bomb? Of course not. So from a purely logical, as you said, spreadsheet standpoint, which is the way his mind worked, this was a no-brainer from his point of view.
Yeah, exactly.
So the ultimate figure always, when you look at any kind of strategic bombing campaign over Europe or Japan or whatever, is of course going to be the human toll. Over 330,000 men, women, and children are killed in these raids. Over 330,000. Further, 473,000 are wounded in some way, shape, or form. In Tokyo alone, 2.8 million people were left homeless. In closing, how did LeMay, James, how did he grapple with the overall human toll? We know that he was a results guy. He was a predator. He wasn't the predator, but you know what I'm getting at here. He was a guy that wanted to get the job done in any way, shape, or form. But he's still a human being with a conscience. How did he grapple with these massive deaths inflicted by his people?
Well, he didn't. I mean, in none of his public speaking, none of his personal writings does he ever express remorse or things like that. I mean, in fact, his personal writings to his wife, in fact, kind of mirrored the things he was saying publicly at that time. So I think LeMay's public statements about, bombing Japan back to the Dark Ages and things like that were kind of how he saw his role there. And after the war, that didn't change. You don't see him suddenly having moments of remorse. I mean, he very much looked at this as a war that we were brought into. We didn't start it, but our job was to be the ones in the end to ultimately finish it. And I think that's kind of who LeMay was. And so he didn't really ever deal with it. I think he just kind of, his view was consistent
from start to finish, all the way through his entire career too.
Yeah.
He's Bill, we always say this. He's a guy we ought to do an episode on. He is a guy we ought to do an episode on, is Curtis LeMay. He's one of the more fascinating figures to come out of American military history.
He needs a new biography, I think, too. I think it's time. And I think, Coffey's biography of him is decades old at this point. I mean, I think LeMay is worth revisiting because I think his early parts of his career are really fascinating.
His operations over Europe. Yeah, I was going to say, there's your next topic, James.
Added to the list.
Yeah, his operations over Europe with the 305th Bombardment Group are significant. I mean, the things that he does, the things that he pulls out, that he extrapolates out of the entire situation, that he witnesses with his own two eyes, are revolutionary for that theater, and those directly affect everything else that happens in the skies, flown over Germany by the 8th Air Force from the time LeMay is there until the end of the war. I mean, he was a guy whose fingerprints were left all over the air war in both Europe and the Pacific. And he really is a fascinating guy, no doubt.
Absolutely.
Well, guys, is there anything else you want to add to this conversation before we wrap it up?
No, tough episode.
Tough episode, but if you want to know more.
Yes. Good point. No, in all seriousness, it is a fantastic book. It's an excellent read. If you haven't read it, please pick it up. Black Snow, James Scott, absolutely fantastic book. Really, really easy read too. You're a hell of a writer. It reads really well.
Thank you.
Yeah. The only personal footnote is when I saw the title of the book, when I was a kid growing up in Ohio, in a steel town like Curtis LeMay, we had black snow every winter because the smokestacks from the steel mill. I was probably 5 or 6 years old before I realized snow doesn't naturally turn black with age. So when I saw the title of your book, that is where my mind went. And so but it was much more poignant genesis of your title than what I was thinking.
That's great, Bill. Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, we want to thank you for listening in on our conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, wherever you receive your podcast. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. If you want to send us a question or a comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, my name is Seth Perrinan, and I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. James, thanks again, my friend, for being here with us. It was an enlightening conversation, and I'm sure we will see you again soon.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Bill, bring us home.
And we'll see you again next week.